Thank you very much. Buenas tardes a todos. Octavio, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I also want to thank Mickey for pulling this event together and the network as well. And Father Kelley, thank you for the beautiful prayer. I thought it was wonderful. And I guess I shouldn't leave out those who paid for lunch, so Verizon and Anheuser-Busch, thank you too. I'm delighted to have a chance to be with you today, and I was laboring over what I might say to you, and finally they told me in my office, they just want you to tell your story, how you got here. And I thought, well, I can do that. I still remember. I'm not that old. And it does have a few twists and turns, but let me at the outset tell you how terrific I think it is that you're doing this, that you're bringing people together to recognize our similarities as Hispanics, but also to relish on the journey that brought us all here. You'll hear a little bit about my story today. We all have a story of how our life meandered along, and particularly those of us in the audience who actually immigrated into this country, many of us have particularly interesting stories. I know that there are others here today who share my background as Peter Pan, and I'll tell you about that in a moment to those of you who've not heard of that. But anyway, it is wonderful that you do come together for this purpose, and I hope that you'll continue to do that, and I wish you continued success. We don't often get off campus in our sanctum over there, you know, on Capitol Hill. And so I'll speak and rush back over there, but it's terrific to have a chance to get away from there for a little while and be with you, and particularly delighted to see former Congressman. You're one of the people who inspire all of us who had followed in your footsteps in public service. So, you know, my story, everybody, as I said, has a story, and I love stories. I love to tell them, and I equally love to hear stories. So I'll take you back to a little city in the northern coast of Cuba where I was born in 1946, so I am at the cutting edge of the baby boomers. Same age as the president and same age as Bill Clinton, so that sort of dates me. A little bit of Woodstock with a Spanish accent, maybe. But I grew up in a really wonderful little city. It's a place where my comfort level was at its all-time high. I had a Jesuit school that I attended, Colegio Sagrado Corazón de Jesús, a wonderful place where my father had gone to school. I went to school there as well, so that tells you a little something about the continuity in my life and the secure sort of cozy feeling that I had living in this city of about, I don't know, 25, 30,000 people. My dad was a veterinarian, and we were not particularly well off, but we were fine, and he loved his profession. My mother was a wonderful lady of great faith, and also, as typical of the time, was just at home taking care of us. She did work on the side a little bit. In her, she had came from a family that was not particularly well-to-do, and so she had gone to work early in life and had not finished schooling, which, you know, in so many of our countries, that's not that unusual. It happens. But in any event, this wonderful, secure environment began to erode as Cuba's political situation continued to unravel, and one dictatorship was then followed by great hope, but then really that hope was dashed before too long by yet another and even more tyrannical dictatorship, which imposed then on Cuba the suffocating lack of movement that communism brings about. One of the first things that happened in my life that really shook my foundation was that the school that my father had attended, that I had attended, was summarily closed. Most of the priests were ushered out of the country. We all of a sudden began to see life change in so many and so dramatic ways as to really begin to wonder if we were in the same place. It's one of those things that you read and would never happen here. Well, it was happening here in our lives. Religious freedoms were curtailed. The ability to dissent was frowned upon and particularly persecuted. Because of a revolutionary zeal, there were firing squads and people were shot, and summary trials and show trials. All of these things were happening with lightning speed, while at the same time the government was ever more present, the committees for the defense of the revolution, and all of these things that have happened in communist countries. And when the freedom is snuffed, the rule of law disappears. And as a result of all of that, particularly those of us who were people of faith, who've been raised in environment of Catholic education, didn't feel comfortable in this world. And my parents began to worry for me, worry for my safety. They had seen young people. I was only, I guess, 14 at the time, but not much older than I, that were beginning to get in trouble. And there was also the fear of conscription into the military service, which would begin at age 16. And in the midst of all of this, the aborted Bay of Pigs invasion occurred, and my father and mother sat me down one day and closed the door to their bedroom so as to not allow anyone to hear, and discuss with me the prospects of leaving in this effort that was very much underground and very secretive of what later became known as Peter Pan. But it was essentially parents sending their children alone in the care of the Catholic Church, and in cahoots with the State Department, who was providing the visas for this to happen. This began as a little movement of helping people who were somehow implicated in efforts to try to undermine the regime, which was a lot of people at the time. And it grew immediately from a couple of dozen families to what ended up being over 14,000 of us unaccompanied minors that came to the United States between December of '60 until the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62 or thereabouts. A wonderful man by the name of Monsignor Brian Walsh in Miami sort of undertook this ad hoc effort, and he did a wonderful job, if not a perfect job, of attempting to provide for all of us. So after preparations, and I won't bore you with the details, but about 6-8 months went by, and all of a sudden I was able to flee Cuba. I flew to Miami, and I was picked up at the airport with another 11 children that were coming unaccompanied, and I was taken to a camp in Miami with where children of age, I think 14 to 18, were being kept. This program went until age 18. The younger ones were taken to another holding place. And from this camp, it was the idea that you would be then sent out into foster homes, other similar camps, maybe of a more permanent nature, all outside Miami, trying to move us around the country. The church was wonderful, but even more wonderful were the people of, I don't know what to call them, I guess the wonderful people of, I was going to say the people of Christ, the people of the church, the people of the Lord, the people who were motivated by their faith to open their home and their hearts to people like me. I went to another camp in Jacksonville for 2 or 3 months, and then the bishop decided that we had to be placed in foster homes. And so that began a process of us 70 or so kids that were at this camp in Jacksonville being placed in foster homes. And what I say about the people who open their hearts and their homes is because I've been, ever since, living in awe of these families. Imagine, being asked from the pulpit that there are these teenage boys, we were all boys that we were being placed, teenage boys, don't speak your language, by the way, because at this point I had been from one camp to another. I didn't speak a word of English. The Jesuits were wonderful, but they didn't teach English that well in their school, so I had taken English classes, but I really hadn't learned that much. And so anyway, all of a sudden, we don't know anything about him, and we don't know how long you're going to have to keep him, but is it okay if we send one your way? And these people, motivated by their faith and animated by a good heart, raise your hand and say, sure. And so I ended up in the home of Walter and Eileen Young in Orlando, Florida, in the summer of 1962. And an incredible journey ensued. It was my Americanization. It was the time that I began to figure out what this country was about. I began to learn the language the hard way. Not too many English as a second language programs that were available at the time. So the family spoke no Spanish, but one of their children had been taking Spanish in high school. He was similar in age to me, and so with his dictionary and sign language and whatever, we began to be a family. We had a little bit of a bonding experience. They picked me up at the Greyhound station and bring me home, and it was now like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and kind of to break the ice, Mrs. Young said, well, would you like something to eat? I finally figured out, sure. So she was scratching her head thinking, well, what can I give this young kid that, would be universal? So she thought, well, what teenager doesn't like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? So she made me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Now, since in Cuba there was no peanut butter, to the untrained eye, peanut butter doesn't look edible, okay? Fortunately, there wasn't a family dog, so I didn't have to wonder. Anyway, so, but you know, through those kinds of little things, as I said, we became a family, really. And these people were absolutely wonderful. They weren't particularly well off, but they were particularly filled with love. And so they helped me a great deal. I went on to Bishop Moore Catholic High School in Orlando and began to learn the difficult ways of fitting in as a teenager. I did hear, you know, for the first time, certain epithets that, you know, are more accustomed to hearing today relating to the immigration debate, you might say. People asking me where I was from every time I opened my mouth, which led me on a quest to try to get rid of the accent, you know, because it was an impediment. Not only did I know the language, but immediately upon talking, it didn't matter what I had to say. People were more focused on the accent than what I was saying. And I had to, you know, understand the ways of American teenagers and the system. I obviously was hopelessly lost in classes because I didn't speak the language, and that persevered for a while, and finally I began to catch on and do a little better. But the great equalizer for me, the most wonderful thing that happened and that allowed me to begin my path of becoming an American happened when they let us know, and I'm sure they announced it over the loudspeakers. I didn't understand it, I'm sure, but at some point someone let me know that tryouts were going on for baseball. And so I went out to play the game that I loved and that I was pretty good at, tall for a Cuban. But you know, at that time, with better reflexes than today, I could hit a fastball. And so anyway, I went out for baseball. And that really all of a sudden opened all kinds of doors for me. Because what I had been shunned and ignored until then, and there was a cluster of us, 12 Cuban boys at this school, all part of this Peter Pan, which, by the way, came from a newspaper story when the program became public and no longer secret, where the writers wrote something like they're leaving Cuba as following Peter Pan or something like that. So it became the Peter Pan flights. In any event, participating in sports was the great equalizer. People really didn't care if you spoke with an accent, if you hit a line drive. And all of a sudden, the truth is that all of a sudden these guys that became my friends, and some are still my friends to this day, allowed me to break out of just being with these other comfortable Cuban kids talking Spanish to one another, to really begin to interact with a greater society of my school environment. And I think to me, more important than learning the language was the process of learning the culture and understanding what America's about. That's why when, you know, talk about this immigration debate today, it is so important to understand that a lot of the objections are not based on the worst sentiments of the American people, but are really rooted on the idea that in the American psychic, when people come to this country, they want to see assimilation. And that is what happened in my life. I began to assimilate, to learn the language, to understand the importance of not just clustering with the other Spanish kids and speaking among ourselves, because that made others feel uncomfortable. And if we're in this country, we need to kind of participate and be a part of the greater whole, while also remaining true to who we are, understanding our heritage, being proud of it. I still speak fluent Spanish, and I'm very proud of it, and I make sure that my children also learn the language, because I think it's important to them. But I also understood that for me to succeed in this country, I had to learn the language of this country. And English was the language of this country. So that was all part of this process that took place at this high school. A couple of years later, I graduated, and you know, there was a gut check. I'll share a quick story with you about one thing that happened as I'm approaching graduation. My guidance counselor, Mrs. McCann, I remember her well. She had a bun in the back of her head, and she taught math and glasses down here. And she looked at my grades. Of course, I'd been, you know, not doing real well because I still was trying to learn the language. And she said, you know, you're really not college material, and you ought to consider being an auto mechanic. And I would love to meet Mrs. McCann again today. I don't know where she is. But the truth is that, you know, we've learned a lot about how to handle people since then. I think guidance counselors today would be a little embarrassed about that one. But the truth is, I'm sure she meant no harm, and she was just trying to accommodate a future that she thought was appropriate for, you know, Hispanic young men. They're probably really interested in cars, and that might be a good thing for him to try to do. in any event, I went on to community college, which is all I could afford to do, and began the process of working my way through college. My parents, we were thankfully reunited in 1966 in Orlando. By the time they came, I was now 19. Fortunately, the foster family had decided, I had now been in a second foster family. Too long for the story. I'm writing a book. You can read it there. But anyway, and the second foster family, equally wonderful. They, obviously, when I turned 18, I got a letter from my dear friend, Monsignor Walsh, and he was announcing to me that it's been really great being able to provide for you and help you. And now that you're 18, we really wish you the very best. But, you know, you're on your own. But, of course, the family was wonderful. They said, no, you stay right here with us. And I continued to go to junior college and work my way through. And then as my parents coming to this country was appearing possible, I was determined to see about finding my dad a job in Orlando. And I was able to line up work for him when he arrived to work at a big dairy farm. And he went through some interviews. I became an interpreter at that point. And from then on, I was kind of my family's interpreter and resettlement officer, which is a pretty common experience to us who were Peter Pans. When our parents finally came, those of us who were fortunate enough to be reunited, some were not, we then became sort of in charge of our parents. And I, since that time, really felt responsible for them and helped them, you know, from grocery shopping to teaching them how to really live in America, open a bank account. My dad would not open a bank account. He kept making me carry the money. By the way, I had saved $250 some, and we spent $200 of that in a car. It was a 1959 Chevrolet with wonderful fins in the back. And I would get in that car and go from, you know, the phone company to the utility company and whatever, you know, paying the bills, $10 here, $8 there, whatever it was. And finally, I convinced him that in America, you get a checking account and you mail the bills in. And after a few months, I persuaded him of that. And it was like that that they also became part of living in America. I'll never forget that a couple of years later, we were able to buy our first home in this country, which, as I was later Housing and Urban Development Secretary, I've always remembered as being such an important time in our family's life. You know, the fact that my dad could say, oye, tenemos casa propia en los Estados Unidos. To him, that was a big deal, you know, to have a house of our own, to feel like we were really a part of cementing our roots and being a part of this American experience, which is why I believe that home ownership is so important. And what I'm doing now is working awfully hard to help people who we helped to get homes to now stay in their homes, given the current crisis that we're seeing. Went on to Florida State University, met my lifelong friend and partner, Kitty, married for 37 years. We've raised 3 children and now have 2 grandchildren and a third on the way. Kitty was wise enough to learn Spanish because my mother, for all the bilingualism I've been telling you about, she hasn't got the message yet. She's still working on it. And if she had been seated at dinner here and you had been speaking English to her, you never would have known, because she has a great smile and a great ability to sort of nod in a way that lets you think that she's understanding you, while in fact she really isn't. But we, you know, moved back to Orlando when I finished law school, and I practiced law for 25 years. I was a trial lawyer. I was a courtroom lawyer, which I couldn't have done if I hadn't mastered the language. Of course, I still consider myself speaking English as a second language, and the fact is that from time to time it shows. But I really managed to have a wonderful legal career, one that I was proud of and enjoyed. And at some point, a desire to give back and to do for others what had been done for me in some way, in addition to volunteering for a lot of things. And as I'm sure many of you know, there's always a board looking for a Hispanic. There's an opening in many community boards. And so I served on a lot of different boards, participating in community activities. But ultimately, I was convinced that I should run for county mayor, county supervisor, or county judge in Texas. And so I did. In 1998, I was elected to that job by a vote of 60% of the people of Central Florida. Only 6 to 8% of the people in that community were Hispanic. So I was able to utilize the skills that I first learned that day that I hit a line drive, and some otherwise uninterested in me kid came up to me and said, hey, what is your name? You know, and we began that process of Americanizing. I never could have won that election had I not become a part of the mainstream of this country. And so I was very proud of that. It was the same day that Jeb Bush was elected governor of Florida. He and I had known each other and became good collaborators, he as governor and me as the mayor of one of the largest urban centers in Florida. And as a result of that friendship, I ended up meeting his brother, who was then governor of Texas and candidate for president. We ultimately, he was good enough to ask me to be HUD secretary, and I came up here to be in his cabinet, the first Cuban-American to be in a presidential cabinet, and one only a handful of Hispanics over the years who's had that privilege, and I was very honored to do that. And I met so many of you as a result of that work at HUD, and did the very best that I could. And then when the opening came for the Senate seat in Florida, I went back to run for the Senate, and it was a tough and spirited race. I was pleased that in my first try at statewide office in Florida, something frankly that very few political figures have been able to do, that I was able to win enough support to become and be proudly represent the great state of Florida in the United States Senate. So that kind of brings us to where we are today. Because of these life experiences, I've carried certain things with me that I think are important. And I always carry with great pride when I heard say today about how proud you might be of my work and who I am. I consider that to be a tremendously important thing to live up to, because I don't ever want to do anything that would discourage a youngster in junior high who maybe looks at a Florida history books and sees my picture in it, to think anything other than here's someone that I can look up to, here's someone that I could be like. When I speak to kids in schools, it's always important for me to say, you can do it too. I speak to bilingual classes where there are children there that are just like I was, just as confused, just as ignorant of what a peanut butter sandwich is as I was, and also awfully confused about the language they're trying to learn or how they are to behave, because our cultures are different. And to let them have that understanding and that feeling that yes, they too can do it. And that if you work hard, you play by the rules, and you have an abiding faith in God, all things are possible in America. And that's sort of where it got me to where I am today. But obviously, when the immigration issue came up, I felt it was a responsibility as the only immigrant in the Senate. There are 2 other Hispanics I'm very proud to serve with, but that I really did have a special responsibility to throw myself into the debate and to try to make a difference for those that otherwise might not have a voice in the discussion. We've not been successful, and I don't want to digress too long into that, because that's really a whole other speech another day. But the fact is that we still have that in the long list of unfinished business that are too tough to handle and too politically expedient to utilize for political gain. The fact of the matter is that we still have that one to get handled, and I hope at some point in the not too distant future we will. But let me touch on 2 other quick things while I have you as a captive audience, and I don't know how long you gave me to speak, but I will only use another 5 minutes, if that. Last night, President John McCain became the nominee of the Republican Party. This is a really exciting and interesting time. Our Hispanic vote is ever more important, and I believe that this election could very well be defined by what happens in the Hispanic vote. Senator Clinton last night had a revival of what appeared to be a campaign that was destined for another one of those exit speeches. The fact of the matter is that she won 67% of the Hispanic vote, and I believe, and Mr. Bonilla would know much better than I because he knows Texas better than I do, but I think it was absolutely the telling factor in her winning the state and remaining alive, and now very much moving on to the potential for her nomination. I'll tell you an interesting thing. In my opinion, John McCain was doomed to lose the nomination because of the position he took on immigration. I happen to believe that he is today our nominee precisely because of the position he took on immigration and precisely because of the position that others took on this very contentious problem. When you look at the vote in Florida, and I think Florida was pivotal to his success. I mean, it was teetering at that point, and he went on from Florida to win California, to win a string of other states, and clear-cut become the nominee. So the exit polls in Florida this year show that Mitt Romney and John McCain shared 33% of the 89% non-Hispanic vote, flat even in non-Hispanic votes. However, when you turn to the Hispanic vote, John McCain got 54% of that vote to 14% for Mitt Romney. John McCain won Florida with a 92,000 or something like that vote advantage. He won Dade County with a 55,000 vote advantage. Dade County is Miami-Dade County, which is the home of a majority Hispanic population. So I would just say to you that the Hispanic vote is going to be vitally important in this upcoming election, and I think it already has been, even as we see the primaries evolve. In the year 2000, George Bush received about 35% of the Hispanic vote. In 2004, he received 44% of the Hispanic vote. And I would dare say to you that whoever is going to be the next president of the United States is going to have to receive somewhere in the vicinity of 50% of the Hispanic vote in order to become president. So it's an interesting election year. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch it all evolve and develop. But I also believe that you as Hispanic leaders have a unique opportunity to keep communities informed, to participate in the process, to help others to participate by encouraging people to sign up and to vote. And obviously the mother's milk of politics is money, so also writing checks, because that is the only way in which we will politically assimilate into the American political system. It's important for the people that all of us in one way or another represent, but it's also important for the country, because one of the things that I have always believed is that we as immigrants to this country have a unique, and I know all of you are not immigrants, but to those of us who are immigrants, we have a unique responsibility to make our contribution and make our mark. Others before us have. You got to think about Alexander Hamilton, who had the same age as I, age of 15, also from the Caribbean, and came to this country. He then became the right-hand man to George Washington as George Washington led the Revolutionary Army to win this country its freedom. He then was the architect of our form of the executive branch of our government. He became Secretary of Treasury, but he became much more than that. He was a creator of how the Washington administration was formed, which was the first one. And through history, our country has benefited greatly by the contributions of other immigrants. And I think now us as Hispanic immigrants, as the predominant immigrant group in this country, have an obligation and a responsibility to fulfill that role yet again for another generation and make our contribution. That's why it's so important that whatever else you do, you encourage Hispanic young people to stay in school and get an education, that you participate in efforts to make sure that that takes place, and that we, in whatever other way, we continue to make a contribution to our communities, whether it be through our businesses, through our not-for-profit efforts, or through our volunteering. Because we can, in fact, make a difference, and it is up to us to be responsible to that next generation of Americans and ensure that we can also answer the call and make sure that we live up to what is expected and what has been in the past, the tradition of every other immigrant class of Americans who come here before us. So thanks for giving me a chance to visit with you. I'm going to go back to the Senate and keep doing the people's work, hopefully, and very much appreciate the chance to come and be with you and the work that you do to keep us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Martinez. On behalf of the Latino Leaders Network, it's my honor to present to you our Nambe Eagle Leadership Award for your outstanding contribution to our community.